Mr. Speaker, we've heard a great deal.
Order. I understand the hubbub in the chamber and an air of excitement for which I'm sure the honourable gentleman, the member for Stone, is suitably grateful. But the House must hear colleagues deliver their speeches, in the first instance to that of the Chair of the European Scrutiny Committee. Sir William Cash.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. We have heard a great deal about the process and the underlying reasons for this motion this morning. But actually, Mr. Speaker, what we are really dealing with here is whether or not this withdrawal agreement should be passed and approved today or not, and if not, why not? The first point I would make in that respect is quite simple and straightforward. It is this, that we, under Article 4 of this agreement, will, for a significant period of time, lose control over the lawmaking which is conferred upon this House by virtue of our election as members of Parliament according to the wishes of the voters in general elections. It is unconscionable, for whatever reason, that this House should be politically castrated by the arrangements set out in this Article 4. Mr. Speaker, it is unthinkable, therefore, that this withdrawal agreement should be passed for that reason alone. And I would just refer to the state of affairs within the German Constitutional Court, which takes precedence over all EU laws. The Court often expresses rulings that insist that the EU can only operate or legislate in accordance with what the Bundestag has given it, and that EU actions are illegal if they depart from the terms in which the Bundestag gave that power. If that is good enough for Germany, Mr. Speaker, it is good enough for this country, is it not? The further point, and this is why I asked the Attorney General about the question of whether or not there would be a withdrawal and implementation bill, even if this withdrawal agreement goes down this evening. And the short answer to that is I got no answer, just as I received no answer from the Prime Minister to several questions I put to her about whether or not the Attorney General had given legal advice in accordance with the Ministerial Code. One of the characteristics of this debate is that when you ask a difficult question, you tend to get no answer. That is not good enough in terms of the accountability of the government to this House. So, Mr. Speaker, that is the point number one regarding the control over laws. It is unconscionable. Secondly, I certainly will.
I'm grateful to my honourable friend for giving way, with whom I have regular discussions. He makes a very interesting point about Germany and the fact that the Bundesverfassungsgericht has often made this point. But is it not true that actually it amounts to no more than to coin a phrase, a political declaration by a court? Because were it tested in front of the ECJ, it would be shown that German law is inferior to European law in just the same way it is for every other member state, and that's why we in the United Kingdom have to have legal exit and stop being a member state, however painful the route it is to get there.
I understand my honourable friend's point, but I have to also point out to him that under EU law, the constitutional orders of the member states, under several cases, Van Genden, Luce and Costa and other ones of the similar kind, it is made abundantly clear that the European Court actually itself asserts superiority over the internal constitutional orders of the country in question. And the reality is that there is a conflict demonstrated by the competence case in relation to the question that he's raised and I've raised, because it is, as I stated, the German Constitutional Court will not countenance direct contradiction with its own law-making. Now, the next point I wish to make, Mr. Speaker, is regarding the Northern Ireland backstop. Now, I know there will be many members of this House who are more than familiar with this. We've spent an enormous amount of time, and justifiably, over this question. But what it really boils down to, Mr. Speaker, is the fact that this is about the constitutional status of Northern Ireland within the United Kingdom. The European Communities Act 1972, Mr. Speaker, was a
Order, I'm sorry to interrupt, but I do think, if I may say so, we should reflect on the fact that this debate is being widely viewed, and it is rather discourteous when a member is addressing the House for there to be a hubbub. Let's listen to the honourable gentleman. Sir William Cash.
I may add to that point, Mr. Speaker, that if they are so blind that they do not want to listen to these points, then, as far as I'm concerned, it makes no difference to me, because the points I'm making are significantly important regarding the question of whether or not we agree to this withdrawal agreement or not. I'll certainly give way.
I'm so grateful to the honourable friend for giving way. This is a problem that he makes a series of very powerful points. Sorry, Mr. Speaker, I do apologise. Isn't the problem that my honourable friend makes a series of very good points, but he's letting the perfect be the enemy of the acceptable. And today we have the chance to leave the European Union, and he and others are preventing that happening, Mr. Speaker.
I, of course, want to leave the European Union, but the problem with this withdrawal agreement is it does not, I assert, represent Brexit in the terms in which the repeal of the 1972 Act, which, as I was saying just now, is an Act of Parliament not only of Great Britain, but also with Northern Ireland. Therefore, the constitutional status of Northern Ireland is at stake with respect to the question of the Northern Ireland backstop, and there is no doubt about that. I'll certainly give way.
I thank my right honourable friend for giving way. Isn't it the case that this withdrawal agreement places irreversible damage forever and will be lasting on Northern Ireland and on our precious Union?
I hear the Prime Minister repeatedly stating when the question of our precious Union. This Northern Ireland backstop drives a coach and horses through the question of the precious Union. That is the problem. And I would further say that the reason why, as I understand it, the DUP will be voting against the withdrawal agreement today is precisely for that purpose. It puts the Union at risk. I will continue. I'll give way to my honourable friend.
Speaker, I'm very grateful to my honourable friend. Is it his view that we're not being shown the bill to implement the withdrawal agreement today, because that would reveal that we have to remove the repeal of the 72 Act or reintroduce all the European Union powers, proving that this is not leaving the European Union?
It's exactly the point, and I see the Solicitor General chuntering a bit. He's a good friend of mine, but I have to say that he knows that this is a serious point. And they have, in discussions, the Attorney General referred to private conversations I've had. I will now refer to one I've had with both him and the Solicitor General. He acknowledges that this is something which would need to be sorted out, because there is a serious worry. And what happened, if I may say so, Mr. Speaker, is very simply stated. On the 26th of June last year, we passed the Withdrawal Act 2018. Section 1 says the European Communities Act 1972 is repealed on exit day. Exit day operates in lockstep with whatever exit day turns out to be. However, the reality is that because of the saving provisions and under Article 4, the capacity of the court to disapply enactments, it is just conceivable, in fact I believe it is highly potentially possible, that there will be issues of interpretation which could arise. We need to discuss this properly, but we can't do it unless we see a copy of that bill. And that is, I know that my honourable friend agrees. In fact, I have ministers, some secretaries of state, who've actually said to me, without disclosing their names, that they do think that we should see a copy of this bill. Because until we see the drafting of it, it isn't possible for us to be able to make a judgment about the impact that it will have on the repeal of the 1972 Act, which itself is the anchor of the referendum. And I repeat the point I'm making about this because the referendum itself was endorsed by a sovereign act of this Parliament, sovereign act, which transferred the decisions to the British people. And the British people made that decision in line with the wishes of the electorate. I'll give way to my honourable friend.
Grateful, and I'm perfectly clear that whatever the public voted for in the referendum or at the last general election, nobody had a clue they were going to be voting for a withdrawal agreement anything like the one before the House today. But can I ask him about a matter of good faith? Because I interpreted the Attorney General's remarks to be a suggestion that we should perhaps approve this today in order to satisfy the technical terms of the extension agreed by the 27 on the basis of some kind of a ruse to get an extra extension, even though we haven't actually approved the withdrawal agreement and the political declaration in the terms that we said we would. Is that an act of good faith with our European partners?
I very much agree with what my right honourable friend is saying, and I go further and say that the change of gear between the 26th of June, when the Withdrawal Act received royal assent, and the 6th of July, and then the introduction of the White Paper after the Chequers proposals, demonstrated to me bad faith, because it must have been pre-planned. While that withdrawal bill was going through, with which I was thoroughly in agreement and gave every conceivable assistance to the government to get it through, and the reality is that because it was only produced 10 days later, you only have to ask the question, how can they write an 80-page white paper without planning it some months in advance? I'll give way to my honourable friend.
I'm grateful to my my honourable friend for giving way, and you know I revere him when it comes to constitutional law. I just wonder, in the course of his argument, isn't he slightly making the case that we need to get to the bill, because it is within the bill, and we debate the bill, that we actually then end up being able to decide what are the protections left. And I would love to hear him in the bill, because I will certainly support his amendments when we get to the bill.
That's a very, very good point. Because, and I make this point, and that is why I've been saying to the Attorney General just now, will he give me an assurance, and he didn't answer my question, that if the withdrawal agreement is not approved tonight, are they going to bring in the bill anyway? Because there are a lot of people who I'm hearing, as Chairman of the Europe, well, I'm very glad to see that the Leader of the House shakes her head, that the withdrawal agreement will not be followed if it is rejected by a bill. Is that absolutely crystal clear? I look at the Leader of the House. Is it quite clear? There will be no bill if, in fact, this agreement is rejected. She doesn't answer. Well, that is the point. So what I say to the House is this: this European Council meeting, this European Council decision is yet another example of the manner in which this country, this great country, has again effectively capitulated to the demands of the European Council. That is one of my greatest objections to this motion, as well as all the other things I've mentioned. And it is exactly the same as when the European Scrutiny Committee last March, a whole year ago, made a report saying we should never, ever have accepted the sequencing or, for that matter, the terms of reference laid down by the European Union. We have capitulated. This is not compromise, Mr. Speaker. This has been capitulation. And that is the reason why it is so important that the House recognises this in the vote this evening. Yeah, I will give way to the lady.
Hey. Well done, Sylvia.
Thank you indeed, Mr. Speaker. I'm enormously grateful that patience is paid off. Let me take the honourable member back to his remarks about Northern Ireland. May I just gently remind him that the DUP do not speak for the majority of people in Northern Ireland. And may I also reflect the fact that the Prime Minister cares deeply about the United Kingdom. She cares so deeply about the United Kingdom that the Good Friday Belfast Agreement and the consent principle are protected in her withdrawal deal. They're protected in black and white, and therefore the constitutional status of Northern Ireland remains the same. It remains in the hands of the people of Northern Ireland voting in a border poll.
Go in the hands of Brussels.
I'm grateful. I have great respect for the Honourable Lady. I only say this, that we've had this debate before. We do differ about it. I, of course, want to see the Good Friday Agreement retained. It's been a tremendous triumph, and I don't wish in any way to disparage that. What I do say, however, is that there are very, very serious questions about the constitutional status of Northern Ireland as a result of the backstop. And I say this to some of my honourable friends who themselves may have changed their minds in respect of whether or not they would approve this withdrawal agreement. I will simply say this, that I have heard all of them, good friends of mine, repeatedly objecting to the fact that this backstop is there. We've had the distinguished Attorney General and the distinguished Solicitor General opining on this subject, and we've had some very interesting outcomes. But the reality is that the Northern Ireland backstop is a massive impediment. In fact, it is an insuperable impediment to agreeing this withdrawal agreement. I will give way.
Very grateful. He talks about opting back in to the European Communities Act, which we all know is what will happen in the transition. But there's a key word there, transition. Does he not accept the risk today of defeating this withdrawal agreement is that we will stay in the European Communities Act forever?
No, because there is no suggestion, and I've heard, that the repeal of the 1972 Act would be itself, the repeal of that Act would be repealed. From either side of the House, there is no question about that, and the reality is that because that is an Act of Parliament and set in stone, I do not believe that that will happen, and furthermore, that the consequence of our moving on to the next phases will reinforce that, and that is my view. I can only say that the British people will be incredibly angry, and they will be very devastated if they find that the repeal of the 1972 Act takes place. And that would be a massive breach of faith with the British people. I'll give way.
I'm very grateful to give way. I understand he will oppose this motion on the basis that he wants a clean break with the European Union. I understand that. But does he realise he'll be walking through the lobbies with people who are looking for a very, very soft Brexit or no Brexit at all? So one of those parties, either you or they, are going to be very, very disappointed.
Well, I will only say this, with respect to that point, that actually I have witnessed over the last few weeks members of my own party, sadly and tragically, repeatedly going through the lobbies, and I even saw the Prime Minister the other day going through the lobbies with the Leader of the Opposition on a certain motion. What I'm saying to you is that this is because of the enormous issues that are at stake in relation to the question who governs us. And that is really why this entire debate is so vitally important to our future. And that is why the repeal of the 72 Act is central to that question.
Will you give way?
I'll give way to...
I'm very grateful to my honourable friend. I particularly appreciate his remarks in respect of Northern Ireland. But the honourable lady, the member for North Down, is precisely right. Will he reflect on the fact that bastions of unionism, such as the Federation of Small Businesses, the CBI, the Ulster Farmers Union and Ulster Chambers of Commerce are all in favour of the withdrawal agreement?
I know that, and I've heard it, but so have the DUP themselves. And I simply say, before I give way to the right honourable gentleman, the reality is that they sit here in this House, having been elected themselves on a proposition. This issue, Mr. Speaker, is all about democratic decision-making. It's about the honesty with which we approach it. It's to do with the trust that is inherent in our taking the instructions of the British people in accordance with the Sovereign Referendum Act. I'll give way to the right honourable gentleman.
And the Democratic Unionist Party has never pretended that it represents the majority of everyone in Northern Ireland, but it represents more people than anybody else. The fact of the matter is there is no party in this House, in government in Scotland, Wales or here, that represents a majority. We have the same proportion of the vote as the SNP in Scotland. Let us be very clear. Let us be very clear. As the right honourable gentleman has pointed out, that every single unionist party in Northern Ireland, never mind individual voices or business groups, every single unionist party, the Ulster Unionists, the TUV, the Progressive Unionists, and all unionist parties agree with the position that this is a problem for the union. Let not people pretend that it is otherwise. That is why we have worked very hard with the Prime Minister to try to get those changes to the backstop that would have allowed us to vote on the withdrawal agreement. That is why we backed the Brady Amendment. That is why we work with her. Sadly, we have not made sufficient progress, but let no one pretend that we don't speak for the Unionists of Northern Ireland.
We agree with every word that the Right Honourable Member has said. This is true, and it is not good enough to talk about our precious union and to damage it. And it is not good enough to say that we will not truly leave the European Union unless we regain control over our laws, which the Prime Minister said in the Lancaster House Agreement, and then for us to arrive at a point where we are politically castrated precisely because for a number of years we will be put at the mercy of our competitors. That is the key issue. It's not just the question of sovereignty in its own right, it's the practical impact as a result of which we will end up by being put at the mercy of our competitors, for example, in relation to state aids. I think, Mr. Speaker, it is important now for me to end my remarks because, as far as I'm concerned, and I'm very glad, I expect all that from this rabble across the road, but that doesn't trouble me one bit. I have done my best, Mr. Speaker, over many, many years to ensure the democracy and sovereignty of this House. And I will never give way on that point. For me, this is a matter of principle. The record speaks for itself. I wish I could vote for this withdrawal agreement, but I have to say it comes, for me, down to a simple question of integrity and a matter of principle. And anyone who wants to question me on that matter can do so. But I say to them, I'm doing this with the best of intentions, as a matter of conscience and as a matter of record.